Good morning, everyone. Thanks for sticking in to the very end of the conference. We've got a great panel here this morning to talk about the subject of overcoming market barriers to advanced grid technologies. And the main idea is this. Utility customers now have affordable technology to generate, manage, and consume a significant share of their own electricity, starting with rooftop solar PV, but including behind-the-meter batteries, thermal energy storage systems, plug-in electric vehicles, combined heat and power, responsive demand-side resources, flexible energy loads, you name it. But all these grid-edge energy technologies are problematic or, shall we say, disruptive for utilities and grid operators. They disrupt the traditional one-way flow of power from generators through power lines to customers. They disrupt the predictability of electricity supply when they're intermittent, as solar and wind are. And of course, they disrupt the economics of the energy business, which is what we're going to be talking about here. And we have the hardware, we have the software, we have the technologies that can incorporate these disruptive distributed energy resources into the grid infrastructure. ARPA-E is funding a lot of these projects and technologies, from grid integrated energy storage, next generation power electronics, to some of the most recent rounds of funding for networked optimized distributed energy systems, or nodes, or the grid data program, which we heard about in a panel yesterday. But the market for these technologies, that's kind of another issue. In a way, the idea of overcoming market barriers that's put in the title of this panel, it may be getting a little bit ahead of where we are, because you need a market in order to have barriers in that market to be overcome, right? But these markets are being created now. They're happening in California, where they're being pieced together through multiple interlocking regulatory proceedings to keep pace with the growth of rooftop solar and plug-in vehicles and energy storage out there. They're being done through kind of grand regulatory economic reconfigurations, as with New York's reforming the energy vision, or REV proceeding. And they're being tackled by utilities like Duke Energy in states where green energy still remains a relative rarity, maybe not quite in the price point yet. So to discuss all this, we've got a great group of panelists with direct experience in how all this is unfolding. To my right, Patty Durand is Executive Director of the Smart Grid Consumer Collaborative. To her right is Josh Gould, a member of Consolidated Edison's Utility of the Future team. Next to him, Lee Mazzochi. Thank you. That's what I forgot to ask. Senior Vice President of Grid Solutions with Duke Energy. And to his right, we have Commissioner Catherine Sandoval with the California Public Utilities Commission. So let's get right into it. Let me ask you, Josh, to start. You worked at ARPA-E's Green Electricity Network Integration Program, funding power electronics software companies like Greentech, Smart Wires, AutoGrid, and now you're with Con Ed's Utility of the Future group, which is demonstrating new technologies and exploring new business models or market constructs to enable distributed energy to earn a market price. I think you guys call it LMP plus D value. So what is that? And can you describe how what you learned at your job with ARPA-E is informing how Con Ed and the New York Public Service Commission and all the parties out there are coming together on these concepts?
Sure. Well, if you figure out the value of LMP plus D, I hope you'll share it with everyone, because I think it illustrates the fact there's a great deal of uncertainty in what the world will look like in the future. And I actually think that illustrates something that ARPA-E has in common with the New York REV initiative is, the world is going to look different in the future, but you don't know exactly what the contours of that future will look like. You need to change to accommodate that future, to better serve your customers, but you're dealing with a sort of uncertain path. So what do you do? And I think there's two things that ARPA-E did really well that we're trying to incorporate at Con Ed. And the first is the importance of hypothesis-based testing. So ARPA-E does that to make explicit a hypothesis that you would prove or disprove through an experiment. And specifically how they do that is what's called a funding opportunity announcement, or a FOA. You define a given program in a given technical area, and you think long and hard about the experiments you're going to run to prove or disprove that hypothesis. It's actually something what Cheryl Martin, the former director of ARPA-E, always used to say, that structure follows strategy. And so if you think long and hard about what your hypothesis is, the experiment you need to run to prove or disprove that should become at least somewhat clear. And that's something we're trying to do at Con Ed. We have a number of demonstration projects through the REV initiative, and we've been trying to be very clear and open and explicit about what our hypotheses are, what the problems we're trying to solve for our customers, and then letting the market provide solutions just in the same way that ARPA-E does. And I think the second factor that's going to be really important in any version of the future, and something that ARPA-E does tremendously as well, is the importance of team. And we actually looked at this at ARPA-E. We ran a regression analysis on our grid projects to determine what are the factors that are consistent amongst the teams that have commercial success. And the thing that kept coming up time and time again was the importance of team competence, team motivation. And you can almost think of it as the sort of chia pet theory of energy innovation, where the circumstances are right and the hypothesis is right. You can kind of add water, add resources, and interesting and cool things happen. And I think you can't overstate the importance of that. And that's something we're trying to incorporate at Con Ed in terms of building our team internally and having a complementary set of skills and backgrounds where we all challenge each other. That's part of the culture. But even more importantly is how we interface with third parties. We want to be a good partner to work with. We want to find the best technologies and partners out there to better serve our customers. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm interested in my fellow panelists' view of kind of what the world is going to look like. But I do think two constants will be, the necessity around doing hypothesis-based testing and the importance of team. That's not going to go away.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Commissioner Sandoval, I think California is definitely moving along some of the same lines as New York, perhaps not in the same manner, but California has a lot more distributed customer-sited energy resources to deal with, I would think, at present than does New York. And you've got a lot of proceedings going on at the CPUC. Two of interest are the DRP, Distribution Resource Plan, and Integration of Distributed Energy Resources, or IDER proceeding. So as we try to flip the way that utilities and customers work on its head, so to speak, and start to bring customers into the equation, I don't know if you have a sense of how you design a market as a regulator that draws the right line between kind of centrally controlled and managed infrastructure, really something that utilities are best suited to handle and thus perhaps capture the value of, versus the kind of services or functions that can best be unlocked, or perhaps can only be unlocked by engaging and rewarding the customers for making the investments.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here. So in California, we've been involved with grid integration with renewable resources for a decade. So we've had a renewable portfolio strategy. We recently passed a bill that would move us to 50% renewables by 2030. We are well on our way to meeting the 33% renewable target by 2020. Most of our utilities right now have at least 18% renewable. As you mentioned, we've been a leader with storage and also with a number of technologies, including solar and wind. So I think that, first of all, I'd like to just make sure that we're focusing the premise of the question right. Mm-hmm. For me, as a regulator, the question is not utilities versus someone else, right? It's not utilities versus customers, utilities versus customer choice, utilities versus renewables, especially because a market like California, where the utilities are not vertically integrated. They get power through power purchase agreements, and so the power is really a pass-through, and then we also have distributed energy. So I think that the real issue for distributed energy, and one of the things that we're looking at with distributed energy integration, is it's that word integration. Mm-hmm. How do we integrate that energy into the system? And we also do understand that customers want choice, but it's also making sure that the choices are consistent with the things that they value in the network. And that means reliable power, safe power, also just and reasonable rates. And so that's why we're very interested in looking at technologies and solutions that can help us to ensure reliability. So for example, one of the things that I've been a big advocate of is smart inverters and early adoption of smart inverters that will enable solar PV to export reactive as well as real power. You know, an electron is an electron. And there's really no good reason that the original inverters that are on most solar PVs don't export reactive power. But without sufficient reactive power, you can have voltage problems. And just earlier last week, I was speaking at an event, a Women in Energy event that was hosted at the California Independent System Operator. And they had asked me to do a technical presentation, and one of the issues they were very interested in was voltage ampere reactive. And so I was making an analogy to spectrum, right? And so when you look at solar PV, you're harnessing the light of the sun that we see from visible light, from infrared, from UV, and it has a certain wavelength, right? There's also a certain wavelength of 60 kilohertz that we're trying to maintain within the line where we're moving electricity. And when we went to the CAISO floor for the California Independent System Operator, you could see one of the things that they're monitoring is frequency. And if frequency gets out of whack, not only are they subject to fines from FERC and they're out of compliance with NERC, but at some point you can have voltage collapse.
Right.
That's not good for anybody. So I think, again, this is about really focusing on what do we value, what do customers value in the system, and how do we make sure that all services can achieve those values.
And you know, Lee, I don't know if you have a perspective from looking at it from the utility out to the customer. Smart inverters would be great, I would presume, a useful resource for you. I know that Duke is working on some R&D on technology standards that can assure that different systems on the edge of the grid can share data and make decisions about how to solve problems like voltage problems on the edge. How do you think, looking at our audience out here, what kind of technologies would you really like to see rooftop PV or microgrid systems bringing to the table so that utilities can engage with that and assure the safety and reliability of the distributed energy and make sure that it's solving problems rather than causing them? And then of course the question is, how do you all share the economic value of the resulting integrated system?
Yeah, so Commissioner Sandoval did a very good job of describing some of the hidden value that customers may not realize that they receive from their electric utility. They think about switching a light on and they don't understand the complex system behind that receptacle to keep voltage stable, to keep frequency at 60 cycles per second, to keep the lights on, keep things reliable. And as we really think about the markets that have developed, there has been a focus so much on the watt hour that we've diminished the value that is hidden. And when you think about new technologies, there are technologies that can promote value certainly beyond just the kilowatt hour. Reactive power is a great example of that, and smart inverters and other low voltage power electronics can offer a great deal of benefit to customers, helping to keep the grid more stable and reliable, providing data and information that can be used by the customer or by the utility. When you think about demand that will be smarter in the future, demand that could be dispatched to be there when the system needs it, or to be reduced when the system doesn't need it, when supply is potentially tight and demand is high. As new technologies develop, thinking about how to take those hidden value propositions and make them available. And then for the utility, it's a matter of how do I translate that to value for my customers? Because at the end of the day, it's really not about the technology, it's about what the technology does for the customer. And we, Duke Energy, we serve 23 million customers, 23 million people in 6 states. The markets are a little different, the public policy is a little different, but regardless, we can create value for those customers as we take these very diverse technologies, integrate them in a way that they are constructive parts of the system, and then share those benefits with the suppliers of those services as well as with the customer.
Gotcha. Speaking of the customer, Patty, I think we tend to, in these discussions, leave the customer to the last in terms of talking about them, but they're kind of the most important part of this puzzle. They're the ones who are going to be buying this stuff, right? At increasingly lower prices. They're the ones who utilities need to reach and kind of engage with in order to bring them into the markets we're theorizing about. And of course, the Smart Grid Consumer Collaborative has arguably the best and most kind of detailed level of kind of research and insight into just what these energy using customers want, what they're willing and unwilling to do. How would you describe some of the key things that you guys see in terms of making sure that utilities and regulators meet the customers where they actually are?
Okay. So we've been doing consumer research, U.S. residential consumer research, for about 5 years, going on 6 now. And what we found is that consumers fall into 5 broad categories or segments of attitudes and values and propensity to purchase, market, innovation, energy technology products and services. And about 2/3 of the U.S. population, or about 3 of our segments, is very interested for various reasons, whether they're climate change, green energy people, or whether they want to save money, or whether they like new technology, maybe they're early adopters. And about 1/3 of the population has no interest in any of it. And so what I think is that a lot of the old school utility, some old school utility people will think that 1/3, will extrapolate that 1/3 to be the entire market. But really, that group gets a disproportionate amount of attention. The 2/3, though, really are where we want to focus as an industry now. So what Lee was saying at Duke Energy is right on, that there's a lot of hidden value in energy technology and in what the utility does day to day and has always done. And there's a lot of new value at hand that we're all here gathered today to talk about. And some of our research has determined that one really interesting thing I'd like to share with you is in our 2016 State of the Consumer Report that we issued in early February, showed that consumers have changed over the 5 years we've been studying them. And there's 3 new areas that of how consumers have changed, with maybe perhaps the most interesting one being when we ask consumers the question, we ask them to say to themselves, I am the first one that I know to buy new technologies and have an interest in new things. The number was quite low 5 years ago at under 20%. But in just 5 years, that number has grown to be over 30% of the US population that says, yes, I am one of the first ones to be interested in new technology. And we don't have a causal reason, but we think that it's because of Apple phones and other iterative technology that have enabled consumers to get used to and comfortable with seeing technology iterate over time. You go from an Apple 4 to a 5 to a 6, and same with Samsung products and so forth. And so I think utilities like Josh's role, the utility of the future, Lee's role at Duke, Commissioner Sandoval's work at CPUC, we're all heading in the same direction, and that is, what is it that consumers want? A lot of consumers want technology now and are comfortable with technology that's not fully baked, that will iterate successfully. They're more comfortable with that now in the last 5 years. And other changes we've seen, one of the key things that we found all 5 years is that consumers have a very strong interest in a cleaner energy portfolio for their utility. The numbers have grown. The numbers were always high. In 2010, they were 80% of consumers who said, yes, I want a cleaner energy portfolio for my utility, but I'm not willing to pay more for it. That number has now grown to almost 90%. So the vast majority of the US population wants a cleaner energy portfolio. Many of them don't want to pay for it, but a larger and larger subset is willing to pay more for energy technology. So those are just some of the changes that we're seeing in the past 5 years. We're seeing a sea change, in other words, of consumer interest in engagement in technology and consumer interest in cleaner energy from their utilities. And many utilities are working to deliver it.
Gotcha. And when you say they're more and more willing to pay for it, how much more willing?
Well, we ask questions along that number. You know, it really depends on the region and it depends on the product. So I don't have a quick and easy answer. And still, the majority of consumers are still saying no, they don't want to pay for it. But what we're looking at are trends of that minority. Is that minority population going up? And our trends show yes, it is. So if utilities and their partners are able to deliver new and innovative technologies that meet consumer values, you'll see adoption. You won't see 100% ubiquitous adoption, but you'll see that 2/3 group that cares about those things for their various attitudes and values that they have, you'll see them adopt.
Gotcha. I'm curious to know too, and this is just a general question, what you guys see as the role of the kind of the aggregator, the third-party aggregator in this. How critical are they going to be able to convert the values that we're looking at for distributed energy that can do stuff that helps the utility and translate that into value for customers? I don't know if any of y'all want to take that.
So we've certainly had active roles of third-party aggregators, especially in energy efficiency and demand response. And so especially in the DR space, they've been very active and really very important, especially when we have events where we have very high demand and we need to be able to call on load. So that's critical, and I think it will continue to be critical. The way that we structure our energy efficiency programs, the utilities are directly involved in energy efficiency. We also have energy efficiency programs specifically for low-income Californians. And so these programs really are absolutely critical, and whether it's run by, there are some nonprofits who are involved, aggregators, the utilities, looking at how can we harness also, we talked about the information piece, which is really what's part of what's so new and exciting, right, is we're now seeing the marriage between electricity and communication and computing, right, that really enables new levels of demand response, new levels of energy efficiency, where, you know, it's things like the air conditioning cycling program, which have been very successful, but also being able to communicate to people's smartphones, you know, or even just to simple cell phones, where you can harness the Lifeline program, both the state Lifeline program, the FCC Lifeline program, to ask people to turn it down a notch, right, in terms of their energy use. And that has been absolutely critical for us. We had to do a lot of work, and we made it through the 2 summers in the aftermath of Santa Onofre. And now, after looking at various plans and beefing up transmission, that's all factored in, and that's all good. But now we have to deal with, because of the natural gas leak at Aliso Canyon, and the leak has now been staved off, but that particular field served a lot of the natural gas needs for the Los Angeles basin, right, including for gas-fired power plants. So we're now looking at how do we manage the reliability issues that could result from being a little low on natural gas in an area of 10 million people. Right. And so looking at structurally embedding energy efficiency and fast demand response is going to be absolutely critical to managing that. So whether it's the simple communication with people, a text, right, the message in a variety of languages, because you look at a place like Los Angeles, in LA, 3/4 of the customers are African American, Latino, or Asian, right? The multicultural market is the general market. So you have to be communicating in a variety of languages, you know, and also thinking about what is the level of technology that people are comfortable with, so that we can once again ensure reliability.
I think one of the really interesting things that Commissioner Sandoval has picked up on is, if you look at the last 10, 15 years on the grid, and you think about how aggregators started as the Internox and Converges of the world, you know, helping customers, and then you know, having a link back to the utility, and I think that model, and the model that Commissioner Sandoval has picked up on, where I think people are tired of and uninterested in the sort of the fighting about the proper role. I think we just want to get stuff done, and getting stuff done, nowadays is that multi-party collaborative approach. And so I think sometimes the arguments about what's the proper role of X or what's the proper role of Y misses something we also touched on to start with, which is what does the customer want? I don't think the customer cares, right? They want that product, they want that service, they want it delivered reliably and at low cost. And I think the fighting about what's the proper role, I think we're only going to see more cross-party collaboration. That's happening with San Onofre, where you have utilities, you have Southern California Edison running a process that was started by the CPUC and is dealing with a bunch of DER providers. And I think that only continues. And so I think, the link here is that's actually what the customers want. They don't want us to fight. They want that service. And I think if we start with what the customers want, the problem we're trying to solve, then we all act in a way that maximizes the benefit to the customer.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think that's just a really important point. And so at Duke, we serve mostly vertically integrated markets. Mm-hmm. And we find it's the same thing. The customers want convenience, they want choice, they want control, they want information, they want to be able to play different roles in their energy experience. And whether it's in a market that is much more competitive on the retail side or a vertically integrated market, the utility needs to be able to accommodate that. And in fact, in some cases, the vertically integrated model allows the utility to provide that value proposition through the ownership of all the resources from the generator all the way to the customer. Certainly in the retail markets, you've got a third party, and we've got to design the utility infrastructure, the technology. We've got to advance the way we're going to do business in the future to be, I'd say, almost agnostic, to work vertically integrated or work in a commercial market, depending on what's best for the state that we serve.
Right. I guess I should ask about, utility-owned rooftop versus kind of third-party aggregator, owned. You could see folks like Solar City getting their hackles up about, a utility owning this stuff. It seems to me that one of the things that we're missing here is the data that will allow us to know how to split this up and who's doing the best job of doing it. There's utility data, but there's also a lot of customer data, and I do like to ask about data sharing because I think it's one of the areas in which startups can get engaged pretty quickly. How do we manage data sharing to enable a market that has the proper sharing of information? How much data must not be shared in order to maintain customer privacy and market integrity? We have 2 minutes left to answer that question, but I am very curious about what you guys think about the proper sharing of data and how technology providers can enable that data to be shared more fully so that we can stop arguing about what the data is and just instead say, here's the data and let's solve the problems based on it.
So I think that consumers own their own data. The utilities have done a great job of protecting that data, as far as I know, and I hope I can always say this. No utility's data has ever been hacked. No consumers have ever been harmed by loss of data from the utility. Now, they have been harmed from Chase, from Target, from banks all across the US. Even national government data has been hacked, but never utility. So good job, utilities. But
not that they're not trying to hack it.
I'm sure they're being tried to hack every day.
Yes.
And it's going to be a never-ending war in our lifetimes to keep data private. And quickly, I think consumers own their data. They should be able to release their data, to have their utility notified to release their data to give them to third parties if they wish, because third-party innovation can't really happen if the data is locked up. And when consumers find value, they'll release it, just as we release data on our phones to allow them to track where we are because we like the map apps. So when they find the value, consumers want to have their data shared, and they have a right to have that shared.
I just think the only thing I'd add is one of the things we talked about up front that can help clarify this is if you have a clear objective in mind, if you have a clear objective about the product or service that you're trying to provide, then it gets easier to determine, okay, what metrics do I need to provide that product or service, and it gets easier to determine, okay, who owns that, what a third party can provide. So again, I think starting from the end in mind can make that division of responsibilities clearer.
And sometimes data-wise, it's also about asking the right questions. So in California, we do have actually a protocol for sharing and accessing data in a way that protects privacy. But we've also directed the utilities to engage in a number of partnerships, for example, through our Water Energy Nexus proceeding, because California has been in a terrible drought for more than 4 years, despite recent rains. That's not enough to solve our drought. But for example, recently, Southern California Gas reported that in their partnerships with water utilities and water agencies, that what they found is that 60% of the time when their water partner was reporting that a customer was using water 24 hours a day or at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, 60% of the time it turned out to be a leaky hot water heater system, which is not only wasting water, it's wasting natural gas. So in light of what's going on with Aliso Canyon, we don't have natural gas to waste. So we're going to be looking at enabling SoCalGas to really step it up to the next level in those partnerships to help to prevent that waste. But it really started from directing and enabling these partnerships, enabling them to gather the data, that then they asked this question that they had never asked before, but that really came synergistically from looking at the customer holistically in terms of both water and energy consumption.
I'll just add, privacy is a big concern, and then data that impacts the security, the reliability, the integrity of the system. We just need to be very thoughtful and deliberate about how we go about sharing that data and even containing some of that data to make sure that our system is there because customers are counting on it every day.
All right. Well, look forward to seeing how data gets shared in the future. And we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and really appreciate it.